Hello and welcome to this third session in this introduction to medieval stained glass. And today I begin a four-part survey of the development of style and technique in medieval stained glass. And in this session I'm going to start at the very beginning. We're going to look at what evidence there is of Anglo-Saxon window glass. It's really very interesting indeed. And then I'm going to look at the major monuments of glass from the 11th and the 12th century, from the Norman or Romanesque period, we might say architecturally. I'm going to look at those major monuments. I'm going to relate them to one another. I'm going to relate them to cross-European currents in style and design, but I'm also going to relate them to other forms of media too, particularly sculpture. The story of Britain's window glass begins in the middle of the 7th century and in York, still a major centre of the study of medieval glass now, so it's rather nice that it is in York. And we're told in a manuscript life of St Wilfrid by Edmer that when Wilfrid becomes Bishop of York in 669, he finds the cathedral church in York to be in decay, and as part of the process of restoration reglazes the windows. He reglazes the windows with glass to prevent birds and the rain getting into the building, so Edmer tells us. Sadly, that building has been lost under many years of the development of York Minster, and none of that window glass from Wilfrid's time has been discovered, even though the Minster has been well excavated. Now, the next piece of evidence we have of window glass from the Anglo-Saxon period comes from the writings of the Venable Bead. Bede was a monk at the Abbey of Monk-Wearmouth in Jarrow, and his mentor was Benedict Biscop, the founding abbot of the monastery. And Bede tells us that around the year 675, Benedict Biscop reconstructs the monastic buildings at Monk-Wearmouth. Here they are. Here's a reconstruction of the abbey that Bede would have lived in, constructed by Benedict Biscop, the abbey church and then the monastic buildings. And Bede tells us that as part of that process, the windows of the new buildings are glazed. And I'll quote Bede's description of what occurs. When the work at Monk-Wearmouth was drawing to completion, Benedict Biscop sent messengers to Gaul to fetch glaziers, craftsmen who were at this time unknown in Britain, that they might glaze the windows of his church, choir and refectory. This was done, and they came, and they not only finished the work required, but from this caused the English to know and learn their handicraft, one that was certainly most suitable for the lanterns of the church and for the vessels required for various uses. It's a really interesting description. So Bede says that there aren't any glaziers in England capable of glazing this new church. That's very odd, given that Wilfrid was reglazing York Minster only 5 or 6 years before. Is it true? We don't know. And that then these glaziers who came from France, from Gaul, then taught the craft to English Anglo-Saxon people. Now, that's interesting in and of itself too. What is described here essentially is that they're teaching them the glassmaker's craft. So Bede says that they teach the handicraft that is suitable for the lanterns of the church, which I assume he means not lamps but windows, lanterns that let in light from above, and also that they're teaching them how to make vessels, glass vessels, used for various other uses. So the implication of this is that they are glassmakers, though it's also implied that they are glaziers too. So it's very curious. It is really rather amazing, but a large quantity of the glass that Benedict Biscop put into his monastic buildings has been rediscovered during archaeological excavations in the 1970s by Rosemary Cramp. Over 1,000 pieces of coloured window glass have so far been discovered in those excavations. Now here are a few examples of those. Now none of the surviving pieces of glass show any evidence of being painted with fired paintwork on them at all, so we don't really know how they were arranged. They're just a kaleidoscope of bits of coloured glass. Now you'll see here on this left hand panel that pieces have been arranged to give a sort of shape of a figure with a halo. That's entirely conjectural. We have no idea if there were figures of that sort in the glazing. A lot of them have been arranged into kaleidoscopic panels like this. I think this one on the right hand side looks like something by Rennie Mackintosh, the Scottish designer from the early 20th century, the Art Nouveau designer. And as you can see here, lots of different colours. Lots of cobalt blue, lots of flashed rubies, some with some really rather nice striations on it. Lots of iron yellows and such like too. Now, recent analysis of these fragments has rather called into question the Venerable Bead's conclusions and suggests that a lot of this glass wasn't made in the northeast of England at all, nor in Gaul, but was in fact made in the Levant, in modern day Lebanon and Syria, which was a major glass producing area. There are telltale signs that the glass was brought into England as muffs of glass, those cylinders. In many cases, one side of the glass is shiny and the other side is matte and striated, which is a distinction that's caused during the flattening of the cylinder in the annealing process. That's visible on many of the fragments. So it's really very interesting. Bede is very clear that Gaulish glazes, glassmakers, came in and taught that craft to the Anglo-Saxons, but the archaeological evidence of the surviving glass recovered suggests instead that those glass workers were in fact glaziers and not glassmakers. They were glaziers glazing the windows using imported glass from the Middle East, which is really very interesting indeed. Now here we see a reconstruction of the monastic church at Jarrow. Here's the church. In fact, it's two churches, a western church and an eastern church. And here are the main monastic buildings, including the refectory, all of which were glazed by Benedict Biscop's Gaulish glaziers. And as you see in this photograph below, the window openings, these are original window openings, are very small indeed. Tiny little arched openings and some circular openings. There isn't much scope for figurative work in this architectural configuration. And that's your lot when it comes to window glass from Anglo-Saxon England. There are 17 other sites that have very small quantities of excavated Anglo-Saxon window glass, but they tell us absolutely nothing about the development of the glazer's craft or style and technique in that period at all. The Norman conquest comes in the 1060s, and between 1060 and 1160 there is also very little surviving glass. There are a couple of monuments which I will describe in a moment. Then from 1160 onwards we have rather a large quantity of surviving medieval glass in major places like York and Canterbury and elsewhere, and then the craft really takes off. Now let's have a look at those two monuments. They are this one in Dalbury, and which is in Derbyshire, and Fledborough, which is in Nottinghamshire. They're not all that exciting, so don't get too don't get too excited about them, not much to anticipate here. So here is the Dalbury monument, and it's a very simple figure of a archangel or angel standing full frontal. As you can see, it was originally in a round-headed window. That round-headed window opening no longer survives. It's been taken out of that and been inserted into a 13th century window. It's a really, really beautiful piece. You can see lovely yellow robes, green apparels, and these gorgeous striated wings. Now, people have suggested this panel of glass is as early as the 1090s or as late as the 1120s. It may well be. It's difficult to tell. As you can see, it's a fairly rustic and rather naive in some respects figure. The paintwork of the face is very crude, very directly painted, but crudely painted. The figure itself is really rather stiff. Now, what's led people to believe that this might be very early indeed is that rusticity to a certain degree, because it does not compare in any respect with the later 12th century glass we will see, but it does compare with monumental sculpture from the early Romanesque period, particularly sculpture on the near continent in Normandy at the beginning of the 12th century. But okay, the evidence is rather circumstantial. We can't draw any really firm conclusions about the date of this glass, simply because there's no other glass like it to compare it with. Now, the next location I want us to look at is at Fledborough in Nottinghamshire, right next to the River Trent. Now, in this panel here, I want us to ignore this head here, and I want us to ignore this head here. They're both 14th century. The head I'm interested in us looking at is this one here, this pink head. Now, it compares very closely to the work at Dalbury, has many of the same characteristics, and it looks nothing like glass of the later 12th century or 13th century or 14th century for that matter. You know, it's modelled in the same way, it's the same full frontal pose. The facial features are modelled in thick line. There's no attempt at shading in any sense. It's very much in the Romanesque, the early Romanesque tradition. This is probably, again, dating from between 1090 and 1130 or thereabouts. But of course, the only thing we have to compare it with is Dalbury. There's nothing else to compare it with which we could close date it. And it's just those two monuments, Dalbury and this fragment at Fledborough, that date from the late 11th and the early part of the 12th century. There's nothing else until we get to about 1150, 1160. Now, we need to go back to York again. Remember, that's where our story began, with Wilfrid reglazing his reconstructed cathedral church in York. York is a central place in the history of stained glass, and we'll come back to York again and again over these next 4 lectures. Now, the cathedral built by Wilfrid was destroyed by the Vikings, but after the Norman conquest, the Norman Archbishop Thomas reconstructed a new cathedral on top of the old, and here is a reconstruction of it. Sadly, this building's life was short-lived. Only 70 years after construction in 1137, it burnt down to the ground, and any glass that was within it was lost in the fire. 15 years after the fire, York gets a new archbishop, Offender Thomas Becket, called Roger de Pont-l'Evêque, and he immediately begins to rebuild Thomas's fire-stricken building, reconstructing large portions of it. the work is so extensive that it takes pretty much until he dies in 1181 to complete the work. Now, on this illustration here, you can see the footprint of the present York Minster, which is mostly late 13th, 14th and early 15th century. You can see here the choir, the central tower, the nave, the south transept, and within it is the footprint of Roger de Pont-l'Evêque's building, so considerably smaller than the present structure. Extraordinarily, a large proportion of the glass of Roger's church it survives, primarily because when the Minster's reconstructed from the late 13th century onwards, as an economy measure, they remove the glass from Roger's building and they reuse it in different parts of the building, primarily in the nave, in the upper windows of the nave called the clear story. And a large number of these panels still remain, and that's what I want to look at now. Now, there are a number of things to bear to mind when looking at this glass from Roger de Pont-l'Evêque's York Minster. Firstly, that the glass is now entirely isolated from its original context. We don't know where it was placed within Roger's Minster building. It is now, as I said, in the nave clerestory of York Minster, amid glass of the late 13th and early 14th century. So that lack of context does affect how we interpret and understand the function and purpose of these panels. Secondly, the glass has been very badly damaged over the intervening period between its creation in the mid to late 12th century and today, and has been heavily restored after the Second World War. And that restoration, which has involved the interpretation of the glass to some degree, might well be problematic. Now, the panels that survive, and what survives are only isolated panels from larger windows and larger sequences, and they were simply used as filling to pad out the nave windows and to save money on glass. So we have a number of panels from the life of Christ, and here are two examples. Let's get the pointer up there for a minute. Look at the beautiful richness of the glass used here. Glorious dark blue, cobalt blue backgrounds, lots of iron green and iron yellow here, and lots of copper flashed ruby as well. We, on this left hand side here, have a panel showing Christ on the road to Emmaus with the two disciples before him, and Christ breaking bread at Emmaus with those two disciples. Now, in terms of interpretation, you'll notice there are lots and lots of break lines, leaded breaks, all the way through these figures, through the robes particularly. So we're not entirely sure this is the correct configuration of this glass. All the heads you see here have been replaced. Now, what's broken in the background here, we appear to have these sort of quatrefoil panels. You see the main scene is within a lobed element called a quatrefoil, but that's been cut down to the left and to the right to fit into this 13th century clerestory window, and the background behind that is very muddled and very muddied. There appears to be red and green foliage, and we'll see some of that in the next slide as we move on. The left-hand panel is probably better preserved than the right-hand panel. There's lots of replacement glass in this right-hand panel. Again, it's been cut down from a quatrefoil, and the background foliage doesn't survive here at all. About 50% of the glass in this panel here dates from after the Second World War. There's also one surviving panel. It's now down in the Undercroft Museum of the Minster, from a tree of Jesse. It's a figure of a king, perhaps King Solomon. A tree of Jesse is a way of laying out the genealogy, the lineage of Christ, from Jesse, the father of King David, all the way through to Christ himself, in the form of a tree with figures inhabiting that. You can see this figure of a king in the centre, probably Solomon, in a foliage background. But notice here the foliage has lost all of its paintwork, more or less. It's very difficult to make out any detail on that. The robe of the king is substantially intact, with beautifully modelled drapery here. The head of the king is a post-war replacement. And here is a composite panel which has been made out of some of those background foliage motifs. As you can see here, they're very stylized. The sort of motifs you get on Norman architecture, on the capitals at the tops of piers, here worked up into a trellis pattern. There is a strong stylistic connection between the glass produced for Roger de Pont-l'Evêque in York and glass produced at much the same time in Normandy. So strong is the stylistic connection that you can probably assume that the same glazers were responsible for some of that work, that Roger was in fact bringing Norman glazes into England to glaze the Minster. So here is a great comparison that shows that. On the left hand side is the panel from the Jesse tree from Roger de Pont-l'Evêque's glazing of York Minster. And on the right hand side is a panel of exactly the same subject from Chartres Cathedral in Normandy. They could be off the same cartoon. The form of the tree is next to identical. The way the branches of the tree curl, and the termination, those wonderful leaves terminating at the top of the branches, where you just look here and here, they're near identical. The pose of the figures, the stiff form of the drapery, all are near identical in form. Sadly, we have absolutely no documentary evidence to prove the link, but I think the stylistic evidence speaks for itself. It's almost certain that Roger was using Norman glaziers in his work at York. Of the glass that Roger put into York Minster in his rebuilding, very little survives. There are 25 figure scenes. There are fragments, very small fragments of 15 more. Many of the panels are really very difficult to interpret due to leaded breaks, decay, paint loss, loss of figurative elements such as heads, etc, etc, etc. Of what we have, there are scenes from the Old Testament and scenes from the New, and panels from the lives of various saints, including very popular ones in the 12th century, St. Benedict, St. Martin and St. Nicholas. This panel here is an episode from the life of St. Nicholas. Probably a whole window filled with these panels, but only 3 actually survive. And as you can see here, they're made up, a lot of it is made up with leaded breaks and bits of disarticulated glass. Just have to look at this figure at the bottom here. The head is not original, that dates from after the Second World War. All these fragments of drapery here, there doesn't seem to be very much connection between them. It's general in form. The head of St. Nicholas is original. There's lots of paint loss. This would have been foliage here in the corner. You can just see a little part of it there, still with paint on, but the vast majority of this glass has lost its original pigment over the intervening 900 years or so. since this window was put in. So it's very, very difficult to interpret, but it's what we have. It's what we have from the mid 12th century. So in the slide, I've pulled up two images for you. The one on the left hand side is a blow up of the face on that panel of St Nicholas that I showed you in the previous slide. And the one on the right hand side, of course, is the Dalbury Angel, which may be 12th century. Just to compare the way the faces here are painted. The Dalbury face is rather crudely and naively painted in some respects, with a single thickness of line all the way through. And that's what seems to indicate it to be early 12th century, though it's not conclusive. But it compares markedly to the head from Roger's panel of St Nicholas. And this is a really, really rather accomplished bit of painting. You know, this painter really knows what they're doing. You know, there is a wonderful natural fluidity to the painting work here. The painters used a range of different brush sizes to achieve a really expressive face. I just love the way that this eyebrow moves into the nose. The way this one single brush stroke all the way through forms both the eyebrow and the nose. I love these sort of flowing features of the beard too. These wonderful wide open almond-shaped eyes really do create a very expressive face. Now you'll notice here everything in this 12th century head is achieved by line alone. There's no form of shading at all. It's cartoon-like and very stylized, and entirely dependent for expressiveness on the line that the painter lays down. So in many respects it's very similar to Byzantine painting of a similar period. It's part of that cross-continental tradition. Now it's worth saying something about the colour palette used in the York glass. Two photographs for comparison, the Jarrow panel that we saw earlier and the Jesse panel from York that we saw a moment ago. There is a similar quality to the colour palette of the glass here. Similar blues, similar yellows, similar greens, and similar flashed rubies all the way through. Now we know the glass from Jarrow is from the Levant, not from England or Normandy. And there is a possibility, I think, maybe on the basis of this, that the glaziers who were working at York, those Norman glaziers, I think, were using glass supplied to them from the Middle East in the same way as Benedict Biscop was at Jarrow. So that really is very interesting. For the next part of the story, we need to head down south to Kent and to Canterbury, the place where St Augustine established Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons in the 7th century. The Anglo-Saxon cathedral in Canterbury burnt down in 1067, the year after the Norman conquest, and it was rebuilt by the first Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, Lanfranc, between 1070 and 1077. That Norman cathedral was the setting for a major event in English history, the martyrdom of Thomas Becket, St Thomas of Canterbury, which took place in that building in the year 1170, 100 years after the building was built. 4 years after Becket's martyrdom, the whole of the Norman east end of the cathedral also burnt down, and rebuilding began almost immediately. That building began an architectural revolution in England. The Archbishop of Canterbury brought in William, the Dean and Chapter of the cathedral, brought in a master mason called William of Sens, a Norman master mason, to rebuild the structure. And he brought into England the very new and avant-garde Gothic style of architecture with its pointed arches. The choir of Canterbury Cathedral is the first place in England where you see the use of pointed arches rather than round-headed arches. Now that east end becomes the setting for a shrine to Thomas Becket and becomes a major place of pilgrimage in late medieval England. So just got our bearings on this grand plan for a moment of the cathedral. The part of the structure we're talking about is this here. This is the choir of the cathedral. This is the structure built by William of Sens in 1174 and the rest of the decade. And parts of the glazing of William of Sens' choir still remain, and that's what I'm going to talk to you about now. And here is the elegant work that William of Sens achieved. Here is the choir of Canterbury Cathedral with its beautiful arches, combination of limestone with a darker Purbeck marble. William of Sens fell from the scaffold while this building was being constructed in 1179. He is really seriously injured and then goes back to France in 1180 where he dies. But the work continues, and the work is then given to a man called William the Englishman, who finishes off William of Sens' work to Sens' design. And here is Sens Cathedral, also by William of Sens, but 20 or 30 years earlier than the choir at Canterbury. You can see the similarity in the two structures. Bringing this style into England began a revolution, and the Gothic style then spread right through England within 10 to 15 years. Quite an extraordinary explosion, just shows how quickly fashion spreads. Now, as soon as the work on the choir of the cathedral was completed, work began on extending further east. Now, Thomas Becket had been canonised 3 years after he was martyred, and had initially been buried in the Norman crypt below the Norman choir. But the Dean and Chapter decided to extend the choir eastward to create a new lavish setting for his shrine, and then to translate his relics from the crypt into that space. And what they built is this structure here, which is called the Trinity Chapel, of course also designed in this case by William the Englishman, but it is just a continuation of the design work of William of Sens in the choir. And it's an apsidal chapel here. The shrine of Becket was to be placed in the centre, and as you see, there's a whole series of steps here because the whole thing is raised above a crypt so that you would see the shrine of Becket over the top of the high altar. And beyond this round chapel here is called the corona, where the top of Becket's head, which had been cut off by those who martyred him, was separately enshrined. And round about was an ambulatory, and all of this needed glazing too. So here's a view east from the choir, where the choir is all these piers here, into this space which is the Trinity Chapel, raised up as you see on a whole series of steps, and beyond you can see the corona. Now this work continued until 1185. In the meantime, the work of glazing the choir of William of Sens and William of the Englishman began almost immediately in the 1170s. There was a huge amount to glaze in this new structure, and the work of glazing William of Sens and William of Englishman's eastern end of Canterbury Cathedral took about 45 years. Now here is the choir again, and you'll notice that it has 3 stories. The main arcading here on either side, north and south. Above that is a walkway called a triforium, and above that are a series of windows just below the vault, which are called a clear story. It's a Victorian term. It just means a story that lets lots of light in. And there are 86 windows to glaze there, And then there are the larger windows of the ambulatory around the Trinity Chapel, the clerestory windows of the Trinity Chapel, and the corona, and the new transepts that are built on either side too. So it's no surprise it takes them 45 years. The glazing in the clerestory of the choir alone, or those 86 windows, date from between 1175 and 1220. And the rest of the glazing dates from 1185 through to about 1222. The glazing of the clerestory of the choir consisted of over 80 figures of the ancestors of Christ, beginning with Adam. Here's the wonderful figure of Adam delving. This is probably the earliest of all the panels. Of these 80 or so panels, only 35 now survive, and none of them are still in the choir. The vast majority have been removed and have been placed in the west end, the west window of the nave, right at the opposite end of the building. Canterbury Cathedral was really very badly damaged by Puritan iconoclasts in the middle of the 17th century. And there's a famous painting showing Puritan iconoclasts smashing the windows with the long sticks. Even the windows up high in the clerestory did not survive intact as a consequence of this. Now, as you can see here, the glass is very similar in style to the work at York. Although we've moved on architecturally and the Norman Romanesque style is now giving away at Canterbury to the earliest expressions of the Gothic, the stained glass, the idiom of stained glass, has not caught up with that, and the glaziers are still working in the style that was common 40 years earlier. But this would begin to change, and this would change as this sequence of figures of the ancestors of Christ were installed in the clerestory of the choir. Now, of course, style gradually changes as these figures are installed in the clerestory of the choir, and you can see that change in style in these two figures, which are about 40 or 45 years apart, part of that sequence of the ancestors of Christ. The figure on the left is of King Abijah, the grandson of King Solomon, and the figure on the right is of his descendant, 10 generations in the future, King Hezekiah, also king of Judah. Abijah dates from about 1180 and Hezekiah dates from around 1220, and you can see the marked difference in these two figures. Now, the figure of Abijah is still in that Romanesque tradition. The pose of the figure is still very stiff. The drapery of his robes is dependent on very thick line indeed. There's almost a sculptural quality to this glass here. The background is still those rich colours that we also saw at York, and in the figure of Adam we saw in the previous slide. But notice too, you've got foliage in the background. The whole figure is set in what we call a vesica piscis, this sort of almond, or mandorla, this sort of almond shape opening, and behind it you can just see very broken fragments of foliage, again painted in a highly stylized form. Then we look at the panel of Hezekiah. The colour palette is more of the same, but there is perhaps a little more variety in the colour palette of the figure of Hezekiah compared to Abijah. But the figure itself is very different indeed. It's much more naturalistic in form, a lot less stiff. You can see the sort of movement of the figure. The figure of Hezekiah is sat upon a throne crowned, but his feet are positioned so you can just imagine he's about to step up out of his throne to meet you. You can't say that about the figure of Abijah. But if you look at the way the drapery is modelled too, a lot less stiffness, the lines are much narrower. There's a greater fluidity and flow to the way the drapery is formed. So there's a real difference emerging by 1220. And also the backgrounds, you know, we have that stiff stylized foliage here. Here the backgrounds are flowing tendrils of foliage, and we'll see in the next session how that sort of foliage decoration really comes to dominate stained glass in the early part of the 13th century. Then let's have a quick look at the glazing of the corona, that chapel at the east end of the Trinity Chapel, in which Thomas Becket's crown, the top of his skull, was separately enshrined from his body. This apsidal, almost circular space was glazed in the late 1180s or early 1190s, and still the glass is very much in that stiff sculptural Romanesque tradition. The glazing here iconographically complements the glazing of the choir clerestory, and is a condensed version in a sense of it. We have a Jesse tree, the ancestors of Christ portrayed in condensed form from Jesse, the father of David, Solomon, a few of the intermediate kings, the figure of the Virgin Mary and Christ himself. On the right hand side here is one of those figures, the figure of King Josias. Again, you'll see that stiff sculptural quality to it. He is holding on for dear life to the tendrils and branches of the tree itself, which at this stage in the late 1180s and 1190s is a lot less stiff and a little bit more fluid than that Jesse tree we saw earlier from the 1160s and 70s from York Minster. So things are beginning to move on at this stage already. Now, a lot of the glass, the figurative glass of this late Romanesque period, has a lot in common with a sculpture of a similar period. And here's one example for comparison for you. On the right hand side here we have a panel from the Corona Jesse tree at Canterbury, and here is the figure of the Blessed Virgin Mary. As you see, she's a full frontal pose, seated on a throne, very stylized in form. Look particularly at the form of the drapery here, which is very stiffly modelled with lots of dark line to delineate these deep folds in her garments. And that compares strongly, I think, with the stylization you see in this sculpture, which is a carving of the Virgin and Child from the late 1150s and early 1160s from Roger de Pont-l'Evêque's Minster in York. It has all the same style qualities to it, particularly the modelling of the drapery. Sadly, this sculpture is so badly damaged in the Reformation, but it must have been a stunning piece to begin with. So there's cross currents, you see, between different media here, between glass and sculpture. I think in this case, glass is probably dependent upon the style it sees in sculpture. So let's move on to look at some glass in another part of Canterbury Cathedral in what is called the ambulatory. Now, the ambulatory is a walkway, as the name suggests. And in Canterbury, the ambulatory is this U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped walkway that goes all the way around the Trinity Chapel, which is this place here, which is where Becket's shrine would originally have been. The purpose of the ambulatory is to create a walkway that keeps all the many pilgrims coming to Becket's shrine away from the monastic choir, so the monks in the choir are not interrupted by the noise from the pilgrims. All the windows here were originally, you can see them on the right hand side here, were originally filled with glass of the 1180s, 1190s or thereabouts, all of which were associated with Becket. They were narrative windows that told the story of Becket's shrine. of these, 7 still remain. If we count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There were originally 10, 7 now remain. Quite an extraordinary survival. Now, the 7 windows that survive in the ambulatory from the late 12th century are almost overpowering in their intensity. You know, firstly, you have a very overpowering colour palette, lots of cobalt blue, lots of flashed ruby red, pot metal yellow, even a lot of manganese purple in these windows. But the windows are also jam-packed with information, with narrative scenes, panel after panel after panel of scenes relating to Becket's life and to miracles that took place at his shrine. Now, I'm going to try not to get too carried away with all the wonderful iconography you see in these windows. That sort of thing is for later on in this course. At the moment, we're concerning ourselves with stylistic development. The glass in the ambulatory is very much in the Norman French Romanesque tradition and owes a lot clearly to French glazes, just as the glass in York did. Here's a wonderful comparison between the window we've just seen at Canterbury and one at Chartres in Normandy. You see at Canterbury here how the panels are arranged in this wonderful cross shape, aren't they, which is rather fine. But it's the same, effectively the same pattern of design we see at Chartres here, the same colour palette, the same intense richness to the windows, but also a similar sort of intensity of iconography. Here at Chartres, rather than the life of Becket, we have the labours of the month, but they're equally packed into the window. There's an attempt to get as much information into the window as can possibly be. Now, that is something that begins to stop as we move into the 13th century. As we see, it's very much a characteristic of both Romanesque glass and also glass of the 15th century that you have these very tightly packed narrative windows full of action. Now, I can't resist but show you 2 panels in detail from these 7 windows, just to give you a sense of the intensity of design within individual panels. These Romanesque glazes at Canterbury were exceptional in their ability to draw cartoons and to create panels that had an awful lot of life within them. And these are 2 great examples of that. Now, the panel on the left hand side here is from a series of about 6 panels that show a miracle associated with the Becket, and it's a miracle, the healing of a man called Hugh of Jervaux. Now, Hugh of Jervaux was a monk who was the cellarer in charge of all the goods coming into Jervaux Abbey in Yorkshire, and he had a chronic condition. He had chronic nosebleeds. Nothing appeared to heal them. He tried every single remedy, but his abbot had just come back from Canterbury on pilgrimage and brought with him some water from Becket's shrine, and he gives Hugh that water, and Hugh is immediately healed. Now, in this particular panel here, we see Hugh giving thanks at the shrine of Thomas Becket for his healing. So there's Hugh in the middle there, and that is the shrine of Thomas Becket. And you can see these little openings where the pilgrims would have put their hands and bodies into the shrine to get close to Becket's relics. But there are a number of things going on here. We've got Hugh's action going on here, but it's a rather multi-layered image, and he is just praying, presumably at the shrine, about to kneel down almost on top of the tomb. But there's something else going on in the background here, which are these figures here who are interacting with one another. This man with a hand, with his hand raised, and these 2 other figures seem to be conversing with him. Presumably this man here is relating to these 2 men the story of Hugh, what's happened to him, which is really rather interesting. So it's an intensity, and there's 2 narratives going on at one time in this particular image. And then this wonderful panel here, which shows a group of pilgrims travelling to Becket Shrine. It could almost be from the Canterbury Tales, couldn't it? From by Geoffrey Chaucer, except we're sort of 250 years earlier in this case. But a similar group of pilgrims, some on horseback, some walking towards Becket Shrine. Again, an intensity. It's a very small panel, but so much detail is packed into this panel, so much detail and so much liveliness. Okay, so far in the 50 minutes of this session, we've looked at half a dozen sites. We've looked at Jarrow, Monk Wearmouth from the Saxon period. We've looked at Dalbury and Fledborough from the early Norman period. And we've looked at York Minster and Canterbury Cathedral from the later Romanesque period. They are basically all the sites we have in England and Wales with glass from before 1200. Now, as the 12th century gives way to the 13th century, so stylistic fashion begins to change. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what happens architecturally in this period in the beginning of the next session. But I want to look now at one final site that has glass that's in transition. A site where we have glass that is in many respects still in the Romanesque style, but has the early signs of a change, and that's Lincoln Cathedral. Now at Lincoln Cathedral, the north transept of the cathedral was rebuilt at the beginning of the 13th century and completed in about 1230. You'll see here's the outside of the north transept of Lincoln. As you can see, it's built in the new Gothic style with pointed arches for the window tops, and built into it is this very large window called a rose window. Now, architecturally, this window is very much in the new architectural idiom, the early English Gothic, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next session. But the glazing of this window, which also dates from 1230, is probably the last gasp of Romanesque glazing in England. So the iconography of this window is the Last Judgment. All of these roundels here on the edge of the window are the original glazing. All of this glazing in the middle here has been intruded from elsewhere. It's been taken out of other windows in Lincoln Cathedral and plonked into the middle of the rose, just to fill in a blank space where glazing has been lost. This figure here is right at the top of the window. It's Christ in Majesty coming to judge the world, supported by the symbols of the evangelists, the four beasts of the book of Revelation. He's sat there on a rainbow. Beautiful use of colour here. Lots of paint loss on this panel, of course. We have again that rich Romanesque colour palette, cobalt blues and flashed rubies all the way. Two panels here, angels blowing the last trump, and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Lots of intruded fragments through this panel here. Now, one thing to notice about these panels is that they are painted in very thick line. And that's partly to do with the position that this glass is installed in. It's very high up. And in order for it to be readable to some degree by the naked eye, it was necessary to create glass that was rather stylized in form. There are the beginnings of a hint here, though, of a change in style. Look around this border surrounding these two angels. You've got these little leaf motifs, little foils, quatrefoils, which you will see as we go into the 13th century become a common stylistic motif. Now here's a detail from that panel of Adam and Eve in creation in the Garden of Eden, the heads of Adam on the left and the head of Eve on the right. You can see here that though there's considerable paint loss to these, that the modelling of the facial features is primarily dependent again upon very thick line in the Romanesque tradition. But we see here too the introduction of a new technique in glass painting called smear shading. So take the head of Eve for instance. Below the chin line here you will notice a sort of very shadowy area. And you will notice that there's a different tonal quality between the left-hand part of her face, which is shown to be in shadow, and the right-hand part. Also a different tonal quality between the main area of cheek and the hair. This is because a process called and technique called smear shading has been used, where a very thin wash of pigment has been applied to the surface to give that differentiation. And this is something that begins to come in towards the end of the 12th century and is becoming predominant at the beginning of the 13th century. So it's a bit of a development in technique. So that adds a bit more subtlety to the modelling of the facial features. No longer are facial features entirely dependent on the black line. They are also shading is also introduced to give definition. It's really instructive to put these two panels side by side. On the left hand side, that panel from Lincoln from the 1230s. On the right hand side, the panel of Adam from Canterbury from the 1180s. 45 years between these two panels, but they are absolutely in the same style. We've got the same tonal quality to the glass, we've got the same rich colour palette, we've even got the same painting techniques. The line and smear shading is present both at Canterbury and at Lincoln. So what accounts for this? You know, at Canterbury they've moved on to a new idiom already. Why in Lincoln in the 1230s are they still putting in glass that's similar to glass of the 1180s? Is this to do with a conservatism of fashion, you know, the slow movement of stylistic changes across the country? We simply don't know. There's nothing to compare this glass to. It really is rather fascinating. But this window in Lincoln, the Dean's Eye in the north transept of the 1230s, is very much the last gasp of the Romanesque style of glass painting in England. Then things begin to shift very quickly. And at Lincoln, we see some of the very first signs of this new style emerging, a style that we will begin to consider in the next part of this course. Now these two panels of glass are from the north choir aisle of Lincoln Cathedral and are also from around 1230 or thereabouts, but in them, unlike the rose window, you can see the beginning of a stylistic change in development taking place. Now you'll notice we have, like at Canterbury and elsewhere, richly packed narrative panels. Here we've got two roundels which show 4 episodes in a particular story. And we'll talk about that story right at the end of this video. But you'll notice behind these roundels, and the roundels are full of packed detail, but also rich pot metal colours like the narrative panels in the ambulatory at Canterbury. But the backgrounds are very different indeed. Rather than again being richly coloured, these backgrounds have an awful lot of white glass in them, and that white glass is arranged geometrically and with stylized foliage. There's also stylized foliage up the sides of the panel in these borders here too. Now there is a certain architectural shift at the beginning of the 13th century that ends up being disseminated into other art forms, including stained glass, and in the next session we will talk about what precisely occurs stylistically. But lastly, to finish this session, what is this iconography? Well, the story presented here is a story from one of the miracles of the Virgin Mary, and it's a bit of an anti-Semitic story too. It's about a dodgy priest called Theophilus, who is misled by a Jewish elder into making a pact with the devil, but the Virgin Mary eventually convincing the devil to give up his hold over Theophilus. So in this panel here we see Theophilus going, that's Theophilus there, going to the Jewish elder to get advice about his life. On the left hand side we see the Jewish elder presenting Theophilus to the devil, and Theophilus is making a deal with the devil. He's selling his soul to the devil in order to have favours in this life. And you can see Theophilus handing to the devil a document with 2 seals on the bottom of it, which is his bond, his oath to the devil. On this side we have got the Blessed Virgin Mary taking the bond away from the devil. She's persuading him to relinquish the bond Theophilus had given the devil, and then she gives it to Theophilus, who hands it to his bishop. So it's a miracle of Mary coming to the aid of Theophilus, coming to the aid of a dissolute priest. So really rather interesting indeed. So there's a little bit of an aside. So a lot packed into this first session. We've gone all the way from the 7th century all the way to the 13th century. It's a huge expanse of change, a lot of political changes, a lot of religious changes in this time, and a lot of architectural changes. And we have seen a lot of stylistic changes too. As we move into the next session, there's a lot more glass to play with. For a start, as soon as we get into the 13th century, there's considerable quantities of glass surviving, and as we move through the Middle Ages and we get to the 14th and the 15th century, there is a lot more. So in the next session, I'll be very much broader in the scope of the discussion, very much broader indeed as we consider 13th and then 14th century glass. I'll be relying on only a selection of sites with glass from that period. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the session. Of course, do keep coming back to these sessions to consolidate your learning if you want, and I look forward to seeing you on the next session where we begin to look at glass of the 13th century. Thanks very much indeed.